My name is Madeline Pierce, and I've always believed that in the world of data analytics, numbers don't lie. People do, but numbers don't. I learned this lesson the hard way on a rain-soaked Tuesday night in Chicago, sitting alone in the sterile glow of my workstation at Cortex Analytics, staring at presentation slides that contained 3 months of my life's work being credited to someone else entirely. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like angry wasps, casting harsh shadows across the empty office floor. It was nearly midnight, and I was the only soul left in the building, save for the security guard who'd grown accustomed to my late-night vigils. My reflection in the dark window showed a woman who looked older than her 29 years, with dark circles under green eyes that had seen too many lines of code and not enough sleep. Cortex Analytics occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in downtown Chicago, its modern facade hiding the growing desperation within. We were a data analytics company specializing in financial modeling, but our flagship product was hemorrhaging clients faster than we could acquire new ones. The technology was outdated, the user interface clunky, and our competitors were eating our lunch with sleeker, more intuitive platforms. That's where I came in. For the past 18 months, I'd been working as a senior data engineer, officially tasked with maintaining legacy systems and occasionally contributing to minor feature updates. But unofficially, during countless nights like this one, I'd been building something revolutionary, something that could save the company and maybe even change the industry. Insight Grid was my baby, my masterpiece, my solution to everything wrong with traditional financial analytics platforms. It was an AI-powered module that could process vast amounts of market data in real time, identify patterns that human analysts missed, and present actionable insights through an interface so intuitive that even executives could use it without training. The underlying algorithms were elegant, the machine learning models were sophisticated, and the user experience was seamless. I'd started developing Insight Grid purely out of frustration. Our existing platform, Data Vault, was so clunky that clients regularly complained about its steep learning curve and limited functionality. I'd spent months analyzing user feedback, identifying pain points, and designing solutions. The breakthrough came when I realized that instead of trying to patch Data Vault's problems, I could build something entirely new from the ground up. The development process had been grueling. I'd taught myself advanced machine learning techniques, studied user interface design principles, and even delved into behavioral psychology to understand how financial analysts actually worked. I'd coded until my fingers cramped, debugged until my eyes burned, and iterated until I'd lost count of version numbers. 3 weeks ago, I'd finally reached a milestone worth sharing. Insight Grid's prototype was functional, impressive, and ready for internal demonstration. I'd requested a meeting with Julian Stark, the director of product development and my immediate supervisor, hoping to secure resources for further development and eventual deployment. Julian was the kind of man who commanded attention the moment he entered a room. Tall, impeccably dressed, with silver hair that suggested wisdom and experience. He had a reputation for being both brilliant and ruthless. He'd joined Cortex Analytics 2 years ago from a major consulting firm, bringing with him an impressive track record of turning around struggling tech companies. Our meeting had taken place in Conference Room B, a sterile space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River. I'd prepared extensively, creating a comprehensive presentation that showcased Insight Grid's capabilities without revealing too much proprietary code. I wanted to generate interest, not hand over the keys to the kingdom. Julian had listened intently as I walked through the demonstration, his dark eyes focused on my laptop screen as I navigated through Insight Grid's interface. The AI correctly identified several market trends that our current platform had missed entirely, processed complex queries in seconds rather than minutes, and presented results in visually stunning dashboards that made data interpretation almost effortless. "This is impressive work, Madeline," Julian had said, leaning back in his leather chair. "Really impressive. You've clearly invested significant time and effort into this project." I'd felt a surge of pride and relief. Finally, someone in leadership was recognizing my contributions. "Thank you." I believe Insight Grid could revolutionize how we approach financial analytics. The potential market applications are enormous. Julian had nodded slowly, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. I agree completely. This has the potential to be transformative for Cortex Analytics. In fact, I think this deserves serious consideration for our upcoming investor meetings. My heart had skipped a beat. Investor meetings meant funding, resources, and the possibility of turning Insight Grid from a side project into a core product offering. I'd love the opportunity to present this to investors, I'd said, trying to keep the excitement out of my voice. Absolutely, Julian had replied smoothly. But first, I'd like to study your work more closely. Would you be willing to share access to the development environment? I want to understand the technical architecture before we move forward with any presentations. I'd hesitated for just a moment. Sharing access meant revealing proprietary code, algorithms, and methodologies that I'd spent months developing. But Julian was my supervisor, and his support was crucial for Insight Grid's future. Of course, I'd said, providing him with read-only access to the development repository. Excellent, Julian had said, standing to signal the end of our meeting. I'll review everything over the next few days and get back to you with next steps. This could be exactly what Cortex Analytics needs to regain its competitive edge. I'd left that meeting feeling optimistic for the first time in months. Finally, my hard work was being recognized. Finally, Insight Grid would get the attention and resources it deserved. Finally, I'd be able to prove that I was more than just a maintenance programmer keeping legacy systems running. But optimism in the corporate world has a half-life shorter than most radioactive isotopes. The first warning sign came 3 days later during our weekly team stand-up meeting. Julian was presenting the product development roadmap for the next quarter, and I'd expected to hear some mention of Insight Grid, even if just as a research project under evaluation. Instead, Julian glossed over my section entirely, mentioning only that I was continuing work on platform optimization and system maintenance. There was no reference to Insight Grid, no acknowledgement of our previous meeting, no indication that anything had changed. I'd raised my hand tentatively. Julian, what about the analytics module we discussed? Should I include that in my quarterly objectives? Julian had looked at me with what seemed like genuine confusion. Analytics module? I'm not sure what you're referring to. Madeline, let's discuss any side projects after the meeting. Side projects? My blood had run cold, but I'd nodded and remained silent for the rest of the meeting. Afterward, when I'd approached Julian privately, he'd been dismissive and vague. I appreciate your enthusiasm for innovation, Madeline, he'd said, not looking up from his laptop. But we need to focus on core responsibilities right now. The company can't afford to have team members pursuing pet projects when there's so much critical maintenance work to be done. Pet projects. The phrase had hit me like a physical blow. 3 months of 18-hour days, hundreds of hours of research and development, breakthrough algorithms that could transform our entire product offering, all dismissed as a pet project. But the real betrayal was yet to come. A week later, I'd arrived at the office to find myself locked out of the Insight Grid development environment. My access credentials were no longer valid, and when I'd contacted IT support, they'd told me that the project had been reassigned and that I no longer had authorized access. Reassigned, not canceled, not shelved, not put on hold. Reassigned. I'd immediately confronted Julian, finding him in his office reviewing what looked suspiciously like Insight Grid's user interface mockups. When I'd knocked on his door, he'd quickly minimized the windows on his screen, but not before I'd caught a glimpse of my own work displayed on his monitor. Julian, I need to talk to you about Insight Grid, I'd said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm sorry. What? Julian had replied, his expression perfectly blank. Insight Grid, the AI analytics module I developed. I've been locked out of the development environment. Julian had frowned as if trying to recall a distant memory. Oh, that. Yes, I've decided to take a different approach with that particular initiative. I've reassigned it to a more senior team that can handle the complexities involved. More senior team. The words had stung, but not as much as what came next. Actually, Madeline, I've been meaning to discuss your performance lately. Your focus seems to have been scattered, and I'm concerned that you're not dedicating sufficient attention to your core responsibilities. I think it would be best if you returned to your assigned duties and left the strategic initiatives to team members with more experience in product development. I'd stood there in stunned silence, watching this man who I'd trusted with my work dismiss 3 months of innovation as distraction from my assigned duties. But what choice did I have? I was an employee. He was my supervisor. And corporate hierarchies were not democracies. I understand, I'd said quietly. Though understanding and accepting were two very different things. That conversation had taken place 2 weeks ago. Since then, I'd been relegated to mundane maintenance tasks while watching Julian gradually assume control of my life's work. He'd been subtle about it, careful not to leave obvious fingerprints, but the signs were unmistakable. He'd started scheduling meetings about strategic product initiatives that I wasn't invited to attend. He'd brought in external consultants to evaluate new technologies that sounded suspiciously similar to Insight Grid's core features. Most damning of all, I'd overheard him discussing his new approach to AI-driven analytics with other department heads. His new approach, built on my code, my algorithms, my countless hours of research and development. I'd tried to document everything, taking screenshots of emails, saving copies of my original development logs, and maintaining detailed records of my conversations with Julian. But I'd been careful not to access anything I wasn't supposed to, not to violate any company policies that could be used against me later. That's what had brought me to the office this rainy Tuesday night, ostensibly working late on a database optimization project but actually conducting reconnaissance on my own stolen work. Earlier that evening, I'd been grabbing coffee from the break room when I'd overheard 2 of our summer interns discussing an upcoming presentation. They'd been excited about something called Project Nexus, which was apparently Julian's new initiative that would be demonstrated to potential investors next week. Project Nexus. Even the name was a pale imitation of Insight Grid's elegant simplicity. After the interns had left, I'd lingered in the break room, my mind racing. An investor presentation meant Julian was preparing to commercialize my work, to take credit for innovations that could potentially be worth millions of dollars. It also meant he was confident enough in his theft to present it to sophisticated investors who would ask detailed technical questions. I'd returned to my desk with a new sense of urgency. If Julian was planning to pitch my work to investors, I needed to know exactly what he was planning to present. More importantly, I needed to find a way to prove that Insight Grid was my creation, not his. The challenge was that Julian had been careful to cover his tracks. He'd locked me out of the official development environment, removed my name from project documentation, and gradually erased any evidence of my involvement in Insight Grid's creation. To an outside observer, it would appear that Project Nexus was entirely his brainchild. But Julian had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated my technical capabilities and my intimate knowledge of Cortex Analytics' internal systems. 6 months ago, I'd been part of a small team conducting a security audit of our network infrastructure. The project had been tedious and largely forgotten, but it had required me to have elevated access privileges to various internal systems. Those privileges had never been revoked. Working carefully and methodically, I'd used my residual access to trace the digital footprints of Julian's theft. I'd found backup copies of my original code repositories, complete with timestamps and version histories that proved my authorship. I'd discovered email threads where Julian discussed leveraging existing internal research without mentioning my name. Most importantly, I'd located the presentation materials Julian was preparing for the investor meeting. Project Nexus was Insight Grid, renamed and rebranded, but fundamentally unchanged. Julian had made cosmetic modifications to the user interface and updated some of the marketing language. But the core algorithms, the technical architecture, and even some of the sample datasets were identical to my original work. The investor presentation was scheduled for Thursday afternoon, just 2 days away. Julian had invited representatives from 3 major venture capital firms, promising to demonstrate revolutionary AI technology that would disrupt the financial analytics industry. Revolutionary AI technology that I had created. As I sat in the empty office that Tuesday night, staring at Julian's stolen presentation slides, I felt something crystallize inside me. This wasn't just about credit or recognition anymore. This was about justice, about ensuring that thieves didn't prosper while creators were forgotten. I'd always believed that the best revenge was massive success. But sometimes the situation called for more direct action. Sometimes, the only way to stop a thief was to catch them in the act, in front of witnesses who couldn't be fooled or intimidated. Julian wanted to present my work to sophisticated investors? Fine. I'd make sure that presentation would be unforgettable, for all the wrong reasons. The plan that formed in my mind over the next several hours was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential impact. Julian thought he understood technology well enough to steal my work and present it as his own. He was about to learn that understanding and mastery were two very different things. I spent the rest of that Tuesday night and most of Wednesday preparing for what I'd privately started calling the reckoning. The beauty of my plan was that it would use Julian's own arrogance and greed against him, turning his theft into the instrument of his professional destruction. Julian's presentation was built on my original codebase, but he'd made enough superficial changes that casual observers might not recognize the similarities. However, buried deep within the code were digital signatures, metadata stamps, and forensic markers that would unambiguously prove the work's true authorship. The challenge was making sure those markers would be revealed at exactly the right moment, in front of exactly the right audience, in a way that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. I'd need to be subtle, patient, and absolutely precise. One mistake, one moment of detection, and Julian would have time to prepare defenses or cancel the presentation entirely. But if I could execute my plan flawlessly, Thursday afternoon would become the day Julian Stark learned the hard way that stealing from the wrong person could destroy more than just careers. Wednesday passed in a blur of careful preparation disguised as routine work. I'd called in sick Thursday morning, claiming food poisoning from a questionable sushi dinner. Julian had been sympathetic, even suggesting I take Friday off as well to fully recover. "Don't worry about anything here," he'd said during our brief phone conversation. "I've got everything under control. Just focus on getting better." Everything under control. If only he knew. The investor presentation was scheduled for 2 p.m. in the executive conference room on the 32nd floor. I'd arrived at the building at 1:30 using a side entrance that avoided the main lobby where I might be recognized. I'd dressed professionally, but unremarkably, just another consultant or vendor with legitimate business in the building. The executive conference room was a temple to corporate ambition, with a massive mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Lake Michigan, while state-of-the-art presentation equipment enabled seamless demonstrations of complex technology. Julian had arrived early, spending time testing his laptop connection and reviewing his notes. He looked confident, relaxed, like a man who'd never doubted his right to claim credit for other people's work. He'd even worn his lucky tie, a silk pattern in blue and gold that he claimed brought him good fortune during important presentations. The investors began arriving at precisely 2 p.m. I recognized them from their LinkedIn profiles and company websites. Sarah Chen from Meridian Ventures, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s known for her technical expertise and aggressive due diligence process. David Rodriguez from Summit Capital, a former software engineer turned investor who specialized in AI and machine learning startups. And Elena Kowalski from North Point Partners, a legendary figure in Chicago's venture capital community who'd backed several unicorn companies. These weren't the kind of investors who could be fooled by slick presentations and empty promises. They were sophisticated professionals who understood technology, market dynamics, and the difference between genuine innovation and clever marketing. If Julian wanted to convince them to invest in Project Nexus, he'd need to demonstrate not just what the technology could do, but how it worked and why it was superior to existing solutions. I'd positioned myself in a small observation room adjacent to the main conference room, ostensibly waiting for a meeting with someone from the legal department. Through the glass partition, I had a clear view of the presentation while remaining invisible to the participants. Julian began his presentation with characteristic confidence, walking through market analysis and competitive positioning before diving into the technical demonstration. He'd clearly rehearsed extensively, smoothly navigating through insight grids, project nexuses, interface while explaining its capabilities. What you're seeing here represents 2 years of intensive research and development, Julian said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. We've created an AI-powered analytics platform that doesn't just process financial data, it understands it, learns from it, and provides insights that human analysts simply cannot match. 2 years of research and development. I had to admire his audacity, even as it made my blood boil. Julian hadn't spent 2 minutes developing the technology he was claiming as his masterpiece. Sarah Chen leaned forward, studying the demonstration intently. The user interface is impressively intuitive, she said. What underlying technologies are you using for the machine learning models? Julian launched into an explanation that was technically accurate but clearly rehearsed. He'd obviously spent time studying my documentation, memorizing key concepts and terminology without truly understanding the underlying principles. To a casual observer, he might have sounded knowledgeable. But to experts like these investors, there were subtle tells that suggested his understanding was more superficial than substantive. David Rodriguez picked up on one of these tells immediately. You mentioned using ensemble methods for predictive modeling, he said, but your demonstration showed results that suggest you're actually using deep neural networks. Can you explain that discrepancy? I watched Julian's face carefully as he processed the question. For just a moment, his confident facade flickered, revealing the panic of someone who'd been caught in knowledge they didn't truly possess. But he recovered quickly, launching into a vague explanation about hybrid approaches and proprietary methodologies. Elena Kowalski wasn't buying it. I'd like to see some of the underlying code, she said bluntly. Not the proprietary algorithms, obviously, but enough to understand your technical architecture and development methodology. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Julian's presentation included several slides of code samples, carefully selected to demonstrate Project Nexus's sophistication without revealing too much proprietary information. What he didn't know was that I'd embedded forensic markers throughout those code samples, digital signatures that would reveal the work's true authorship to anyone who knew how to look. Of course, Julian said, advancing to his technical slides. Here's an example of our core processing engine. The code appeared on the large display screen, and I held my breath as Julian began explaining its functionality. To his credit, he managed to provide a reasonably accurate description of what the code did, though his explanation lacked the depth and nuance that would come from having actually written it. But hidden within that code, invisible to casual observation but unmistakable to forensic analysis, were the digital fingerprints that would prove everything. Variable naming conventions that followed my personal style guidelines, comment structures that matched my documentation patterns, algorithm implementations that bore the hallmarks of my problem-solving approach. Most importantly, embedded within the metadata of the presentation file itself were timestamps and version histories that told the real story of Project Nexus's development. Sarah Chen was studying the code samples with intense focus, her technical background allowing her to analyze the architecture and methodology at a level that most investors couldn't match. This is sophisticated work, she said slowly. The algorithmic approach is particularly elegant. How long did it take you to develop this specific module? Julian began to answer, but I'd heard enough. It was time to activate the trap I'd so carefully prepared. During my reconnaissance the previous night, I'd discovered that Julian's presentation was stored on Cortex Analytics' internal network, accessible through the same shared drive system that all employees used for collaborative projects. More importantly, I still had edit access to that shared drive through my residual security audit privileges. Working remotely from my tablet, I made a single, precisely targeted modification to Julian's presentation file. I didn't change any of his slides or alter his talking points. Instead, I activated a hidden feature that I'd embedded in the original Insight Grid codebase months ago. a forensic audit trail that could display comprehensive metadata about the code's development history. This feature had been designed as a security measure, a way to track unauthorized modifications or theft of proprietary algorithms. It was triggered by a specific combination of user actions that would be unlikely to occur during normal operation, but which I could activate remotely if necessary. Julian continued his presentation, unaware that his next mouse click would unleash a digital time bomb that would destroy his credibility and expose his theft to the most powerful investors in Chicago. "Let me show you how the system handles complex queries," Julian said, navigating to his final demonstration slide. He clicked on the presentation screen, and for a moment, nothing seemed different. The demonstration proceeded normally, with Project Nexus processing a sample dataset and generating analytical insights. Julian's confidence was returning as he guided the investors through the system's capabilities. But then Elena Kowalski noticed something. "There's additional information appearing in the corner of the screen," she said, pointing to a small text overlay that had begun displaying system metadata. Julian glanced at the screen, and I saw the exact moment when he realized something was wrong. The metadata overlay was showing development timestamps, author information, and version histories that he hadn't intended to share. More damaging still, the overlay was clearly indicating that the core algorithms had been developed by someone named Madeline Pierce, with initial development dating back far earlier than Julian's claimed timeline. "That's just," Julian began, then stopped as more information continued to appear on the screen. The forensic audit trail was systematically revealing the true development history of Insight Grid, showing dates, times, and authorship information that painted a very different picture than Julian's presentation. David Rodriguez was reading the metadata display with growing interest. According to this information, the foundational code was written by Madeline Pierce between 8 and 12 months ago. Who is Madeline Pierce, and what was her role in this project? Julian's face had gone pale, but he tried to maintain his composure. "Madeline is one of our data engineers. She contributed some preliminary research, but the core innovation and development was done by my team under my direction." It was a reasonable explanation, the kind of answer that might have satisfied less sophisticated investors. But these three individuals hadn't built successful venture capital careers by accepting reasonable explanations without verification. Sarah Chen was studying her own tablet, clearly researching something. "I'm looking at Cortex Analytics employee directory," she said. "Madeline Pierce is listed as a senior data engineer with extensive experience in AI and machine learning. Her background suggests she'd be more than capable of developing this technology independently." The metadata overlay continued to reveal damaging information, showing detailed commit logs that documented every change made to the Insight Grid codebase. The timestamps and authorship data created an undeniable timeline that contradicted Julian's claims about Project Nexus's development. "There seems to be some confusion about the development timeline," Elena Kowalski said, her tone becoming noticeably cooler. "The metadata suggests that most of this work was completed months before you claimed to have started the project." Julian was beginning to panic, his confident facade cracking under the weight of evidence that he couldn't explain away. "There must be some kind of technical error," he said, frantically clicking through his presentation slides. "This metadata display isn't part of the normal interface. Someone must have tampered with the system." But his attempts to dismiss the evidence only made things worse. The forensic audit trail had been designed to be tamper-proof, and every click Julian made only revealed more incriminating information. Code comments that included my name, development notes that referenced my personal research, and most damaging of all, timestamps that showed the original Insight Grid development had occurred entirely outside of Julian's supposed project timeline. David Rodriguez stood up, his expression grim. "I think we need to pause this presentation until we can get some clarity about the true authorship of this technology." "That's not necessary," Julian said quickly. "I can explain everything. Madeline Pierce was part of my development team, and naturally some of her preliminary work would show up in the version history." But Sarah Chen was already shaking her head. "The metadata doesn't support that explanation. It shows sustained, independent development by Ms. Pierce." with your name appearing only in recent modifications that seem to involve rebranding and presentation preparation. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and completely devastating to Julian's credibility. He'd been caught red-handed, stealing credit for work he'd never done, in front of investors who could destroy his career with a few well-placed phone calls. Elena Kowalski closed her tablet and stood up. Mr. Stark, I'm afraid we're going to need to suspend this evaluation until we can speak directly with Ms. Pierce and verify the true development history of this technology. Julian made one last desperate attempt to control the narrative. I understand your concerns, he said, but Madeline Pierce is currently out sick, and I'm afraid she's not available for consultation. It was at that moment that I decided to make my entrance. I walked into the conference room calmly, carrying a folder of documentation that I'd prepared over the past 2 days. Julian's face went white when he saw me, but I ignored him completely, focusing instead on the 3 investors who were studying me with intense curiosity. Good afternoon, I said, setting my folder on the conference table. I'm Madeline Pierce, and I believe you've been reviewing my work. The silence that followed was profound and electric. Julian stood frozen behind the presentation screen, his mouth slightly open as he processed the implications of my sudden appearance. The investors exchanged glances that conveyed volumes about their assessment of the situation. Sarah Chen spoke first. Ms. Pierce, we've been observing some concerning discrepancies in the presentation we just received. According to the metadata embedded in the demonstration, you appear to be the primary developer of this technology. I opened my folder and began distributing copies of my documentation. That's correct. The system you've been seeing demonstrated is called Insight Grid, and I developed it independently over a period of approximately 8 months. I have comprehensive documentation of the development process, including version histories, research notes, and communication records. David Rodriguez was already examining my documentation, his technical background allowing him to quickly assess its authenticity and comprehensiveness. This appears to be legitimate development documentation, he said. The level of detail and technical depth suggests hands-on development experience, not management oversight. Julian finally found his voice. Madeline, I'm surprised to see you here. I thought you were out sick today. I looked at him directly for the first time since entering the room. I recovered more quickly than expected, especially when I learned that someone was presenting my work to investors without my knowledge or consent. Elena Kowalski's expression had hardened into something that suggested Julian's career prospects had just taken a dramatic turn for the worse. Mr. Stark, are you claiming credit for technology that was developed by Ms. Pierce? Julian's face was a study in desperation as he realized that his carefully constructed deception was collapsing around him. There's been a misunderstanding, he said. Madeline was part of my development team, and naturally her contributions would be reflected in the final product. But I had prepared for exactly this deflection. From my folder, I produced email records showing Julian's initial dismissal of Insight Grid as a pet project, followed by his systematic exclusion of me from development meetings and his appropriation of my access credentials. These email records show that Mr. Stark initially dismissed Insight Grid as irrelevant to our core business priorities, I said, handing copies to each investor. He only became interested in the project after I demonstrated its potential, and his interest manifested as taking control of my work rather than supporting its development. Sarah Chen was reading through the email records with growing indignation. These communications suggest that you were not only excluded from the development process that Mr. Stark claims to have led, but that he actively discouraged your work on this project. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Julian had been caught in a web of lies that he couldn't escape, in front of investors whose opinion of him would determine his future prospects in the technology industry. David Rodriguez closed his copy of my documentation and looked directly at Julian. Mr. Stark, based on the evidence we've reviewed today, it appears that you've misrepresented both your role in developing this technology and the contributions of your team members. This kind of misrepresentation is completely unacceptable in any business context, but especially when seeking investment funding. Julian's last-ditch effort to salvage the situation was both pathetic and revealing. "I was protecting the company's intellectual property interests," he said. "As director of product development, I have the authority to manage how our technologies are presented to external parties." But Elena Kowalski wasn't having any of it. Managing presentation and claiming personal credit for other people's work are two entirely different things. "Mr. Stark, your presentation clearly indicated that you were the primary developer of this technology, which the evidence suggests is completely false. I had achieved everything I'd hoped for, but I wasn't finished yet. From my folder, I produced one final document, a technical specification that demonstrated not just my authorship of Insight Grid, but my deep understanding of its architecture and potential applications. If you'd like to verify my technical expertise," I said, "I'd be happy to answer any questions about Insight Grid's architecture, development methodology, or potential market applications." Sarah Chen immediately took me up on the offer. "Can you explain the algorithmic approach you used for the predictive modeling component?" I launched into a detailed technical explanation that demonstrated not just my knowledge of the code, but my understanding of the theoretical principles underlying its development. I explained design decisions, discussed alternative approaches I'd considered and rejected, and outlined potential improvements that could be implemented in future versions. It was a performance that Julian couldn't have matched even with weeks of preparation, because it was based on genuine expertise rather than memorized talking points. David Rodriguez asked follow-up questions about scalability and performance optimization, which I answered with the confidence of someone who had actually wrestled with those challenges during development. Elena Kowalski inquired about market positioning and competitive advantages, and I provided insights that came from months of research and analysis. Throughout this impromptu technical interview, Julian stood silently behind the presentation screen, his professional reputation crumbling with each question I answered competently and each detail I provided that he couldn't have known without having done the actual development work. After 20 minutes of technical discussion, Sarah Chen reached her conclusion. "Ms. Pierce, it's clear that you have both the technical expertise and the detailed knowledge that comes from having personally developed this technology. Your documentation is comprehensive and authentic, and your understanding of the system is clearly that of its primary architect." She turned to Julian with an expression of professional disgust. "Mr. Stark, your conduct today has been unprofessional and unethical. Attempting to claim credit for other people's work is bad enough, but doing so in front of potential investors represents a level of deception that we cannot and will not tolerate." David Rodriguez was equally blunt. "Mr. Stark, you should know that we'll be sharing our assessment of today's presentation with our network of professional contacts. The technology and venture capital communities in Chicago are smaller and more interconnected than most people realize." The implicit threat was clear. Julian's reputation in the industry would be destroyed by the end of the week. No reputable company would hire someone who'd been caught stealing credit for other people's work. And no investor would trust someone who'd tried to deceive them so blatantly. Elena Kowalski delivered the final blow. "Mr. Stark, I think it would be best if you excused yourself from this meeting. We'd like to continue our discussion with Ms. Pierce about the legitimate opportunities for Insight Grid." Julian's face cycled through several shades of red and white as he processed the complete destruction of his professional prospects. He looked at me with an expression that mixed hatred, disbelief, and grudging respect for the thoroughness of his defeat. "This isn't over, Madeline," he said quietly as he gathered his materials. I met his gaze steadily. "Yes, it is." Julian left the conference room without another word, and I never saw him again. I later learned that he'd been terminated from Cortex Analytics that same afternoon, officially for misrepresentation of project authorship and violation of intellectual property protocols. But his departure was just the beginning of Insight Grid's real story. The investors who'd witnessed Julian's humiliation were genuinely impressed with both the technology and my handling of an impossible situation. Sarah Chen had been particularly intrigued by Insight Grid's potential applications beyond financial analytics, while David Rodriguez was excited about the scalability of the underlying AI architecture. Elena Kowalski, with her legendary instincts for identifying breakthrough technologies, had been the most enthusiastic. Madeline, what would it take to get Insight Grid to market as an independent product? She'd asked. The conversation that followed changed my life in ways I'd never imagined possible. Within 2 weeks, I'd negotiated a licensing agreement that gave me control over Insight Grid's development and commercialization while providing Cortex Analytics with a revenue share that more than compensated for my departure from the company. Within a month, I'd secured seed funding from all 3 venture capital firms that had witnessed Julian's downfall. The irony wasn't lost on me. The presentation that was supposed to establish Julian's reputation as an innovative leader had instead launched my career as an entrepreneur. Within 6 months, Insight Grid had become the foundation of Pierce Analytics, a startup that was revolutionizing how financial institutions approach data analysis and market prediction. The technology that Julian had tried to steal was generating millions in revenue and establishing me as a respected figure in Chicago's technology community. But perhaps the most satisfying part of the whole experience was discovering that revenge, when properly executed, doesn't require anger or hatred. It simply requires patience, preparation, and the willingness to let thieves destroy themselves with their own greed and arrogance. Julian Stark had thought he was stealing my work. Instead, he'd given me the opportunity to expose his incompetence and dishonesty to the people who mattered most in our industry. He'd intended to use my innovation to advance his career, but instead he'd provided me with the perfect platform to launch my own. The last I heard, Julian was working at a small consulting firm in Milwaukee, his reputation in Chicago's technology community permanently tainted by his attempt to claim credit for Insight Grid. His LinkedIn profile no longer mentioned his time at Cortex Analytics, and mutual contacts reported that he'd become bitter and paranoid, convinced that his former colleagues were actively working to undermine his career. They weren't, of course. Julian had destroyed his own reputation so thoroughly that no additional effort was required. As for me, I was sitting in my new office overlooking Lake Michigan, reviewing technical specifications for Insight Grid's next major update. Pierce Analytics had grown to 30 employees, with development teams in Chicago and Austin working on applications that would extend our technology into new markets and industries. The irony was perfect. Julian's theft had inadvertently given me everything I'd ever wanted. By trying to steal credit for my work, he'd forced me to document its authorship so thoroughly that when the truth came out, there was no doubt about who deserved recognition for Insight Grid's innovation. My phone buzzed with a notification from TechCrunch announcing that Pierce Analytics had just been named to their 50 Startups to Watch list. The article included a quote from Elena Kowalski describing me as one of the most impressive technical founders we've encountered in the past decade. I thought about that rainy Tuesday night when I'd sat alone in Cortex Analytics' empty office, staring at Julian's stolen presentation slides and feeling like my world had collapsed. I'd believed then that my options were limited to accepting the theft, or futilely complaining to HR managers who would side with a director over a data engineer. I'd been wrong about my options, but right about one thing. Numbers don't lie. The metadata embedded in every line of code, every version, commit, every development timestamp had told the true story of Insight Grid's creation. Julian had been so focused on stealing the visible aspects of my work that he'd never considered the invisible forensic trail that would ultimately expose his deception. The venture capital presentation that was supposed to be Julian's triumph had become his professional obituary, written in code comments and commit logs that he'd never bothered to understand. He'd thought that changing slide templates and presentation graphics would be enough to transform theft into legitimate innovation. But technology leaves fingerprints that can't be erased by superficial modifications. Every algorithm bears the signature of its creator's problem-solving approach. Every codebase reflects the coding style and documentation habits of its author. Every development timeline tells a story that can't be rewritten by changing names on presentation slides. Julian had made the classic mistake of assuming that understanding what technology does is the same as understanding how it works. He could demonstrate Insight Grid's capabilities and recite marketing talking points about its features, but he couldn't explain the architectural decisions that made those capabilities possible or discuss the trade-offs involved in different implementation approaches. When sophisticated investors had asked detailed technical questions, Julian's superficial knowledge had been exposed immediately. His memorized explanations had contained subtle but telling inaccuracies that revealed his lack of genuine expertise. Most damaging of all, he'd been unable to discuss Insight Grid's potential evolution or improvement because he didn't understand the foundational principles underlying its current implementation. The forensic audit trail that had destroyed Julian's presentation had been designed as a security feature, but it had functioned perfectly as a justice mechanism. Every piece of evidence it revealed had been objective, verifiable, and impossible to dismiss as personal opinion or workplace politics. The investors who'd witnessed Julian's exposure had been impressed not just by the technology, but by my handling of an impossible situation. I'd presented evidence calmly and professionally, answered technical questions competently, and demonstrated the kind of grace under pressure that they valued in potential business partners. More importantly, I'd shown that I possessed the moral courage to confront theft and deception, even when doing so involved significant personal and professional risk. That kind of integrity was rare in any industry, but especially valuable in the venture capital world where trust was the foundation of every relationship. The weeks following Julian's termination had been a whirlwind of opportunity and validation. Sarah Chen had introduced me to portfolio companies that could benefit from Insight Grid's capabilities. David Rodriguez had connected me with technical advisors who could help scale the technology for enterprise applications. Elena Kowalski had provided strategic guidance that proved invaluable as I navigated the transition from employee to entrepreneur. But perhaps the most satisfying development had been the response from my former colleagues at Cortex Analytics. Word of Julian's deception had spread quickly through the company, and I'd received dozens of messages from coworkers expressing support and sharing their own stories of Julian's questionable management practices. It turned out that I wasn't the first person Julian had tried to marginalize or steal credit from. Several other engineers had experienced similar treatment, though none had possessed the documentation or technical leverage necessary to expose his behavior effectively. Julian's pattern of appropriating other people's work had been an open secret among technical staff, but management had either been unaware or unwilling to address the problem. My exposure of Julian's theft had apparently given other victims the courage to come forward with their own complaints. Within a month of his termination, Cortex Analytics had implemented new intellectual property tracking procedures and revised their project attribution policies to ensure that individual contributions were properly documented and credited. The company had also reached out to me about serving as a consultant on technology initiatives that could benefit from Insight Grid's capabilities. They'd offered generous compensation and flexible terms that would allow me to maintain my independence while contributing to projects that aligned with my interests. It was a remarkable turnaround from the days when Julian had dismissed my work as irrelevant pet projects. Now Cortex Analytics was eager to license my technology and leverage my expertise for their most important strategic initiatives. But the most profound change had been personal rather than professional. The experience of confronting Julian's theft had taught me that I possessed capabilities and resources I'd never fully recognized. I'd always thought of myself as a competent engineer who was good at solving technical problems, but I'd discovered that I was also capable of strategic thinking, investigative analysis, and high-stakes confrontation when circumstances required it. The skills I'd used to expose Julian's deception, forensic analysis, evidence documentation, strategic planning, and tactical execution had proven just as valuable in building Pierce Analytics as my technical expertise. Running a startup required the ability to anticipate problems, gather information, and respond effectively to unexpected challenges. Julian's theft had inadvertently provided me with intensive training in exactly those capabilities. I'd also learned that justice wasn't always about punishment or revenge. The most effective response to Julian's theft hadn't been to destroy his career out of anger or spite, but to demonstrate the truth so clearly that destruction became inevitable. By focusing on facts rather than emotions, evidence rather than accusations, I'd achieved a result that was both more satisfying and more permanent than any revenge fantasy could have provided. Julian's reputation in Chicago's technology community had been destroyed, not because I'd spread rumors or made personal attacks, but because sophisticated professionals had witnessed his deception firsthand. The investors who'd seen him try to claim credit for my work had shared their assessment with colleagues, and word of his dishonesty had spread through professional networks with the efficiency of digital communication. No one needed to actively campaign against Julian because his own actions had provided more than enough evidence of his character and competence. The venture capital and technology communities were small, interconnected worlds where reputation was everything and trust was impossible to rebuild once lost. As I reviewed the latest development milestones for Insight Grid's next release, I reflected on how completely the situation had been transformed. Julian had tried to steal my work to advance his career, but instead he'd given me the motivation and opportunity to build something far more valuable than a promotion or salary increase. Pierce Analytics was now developing applications that would extend Insight Grid's capabilities into healthcare analytics, supply chain optimization, and risk management. The algorithms that Julian had tried to appropriate were being licensed by Fortune 500 companies and generating revenue that would fund research into even more innovative technologies. The startup world had proven to be a perfect fit for my combination of technical expertise and strategic thinking. Unlike the corporate environment where Julian's political maneuvering had given him advantages despite his limited capabilities, the venture capital ecosystem rewarded results, innovation, and demonstrated competence. Investors didn't care about office politics or management hierarchies. They cared about technology that worked, markets that could be captured, and teams that could execute complex strategies successfully. My ability to develop breakthrough algorithms and my willingness to confront deception when necessary had made me exactly the kind of founder they wanted to support. The funding Pierce Analytics had secured was more than sufficient to hire top-tier talent, invest in cutting-edge infrastructure, and pursue market opportunities that would have been impossible within the constraints of a traditional corporate structure. I was building the kind of company I'd always wanted to work for, with the kind of culture that rewarded innovation and integrity rather than politics and theft. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the whole experience was knowing that Julian's attempted theft had ultimately benefited everyone except Julian himself. Cortex Analytics had received licensing revenue and consulting services that more than compensated for my departure. The investors who'd witnessed Julian's deception had discovered a promising investment opportunity that was generating strong returns. My former colleagues had benefited from improved attribution policies and a work environment that no longer tolerated credit theft. Even the broader technology community had benefited from the exposure of Julian's practices. Word of his deception had served as a cautionary tale about the consequences of stealing credit for other people's work, potentially deterring similar behavior by other would-be thieves. Julian was the only person who'd been harmed by his actions, and that harm had been entirely self-inflicted. His attempt to advance his career through theft had destroyed his reputation, eliminated his job prospects, and excluded him from the professional network that was essential for success in the technology industry. The justice of that outcome was both profound and permanent. Julian couldn't rebuild his reputation by changing companies or relocating to different cities because his deception had been witnessed by people whose opinions carried weight throughout the industry. He couldn't claim that his termination had been unfair or political because the evidence of his theft was objective and undeniable. Most importantly, he couldn't repeat his pattern of stealing credit from others because his reputation for dishonesty had preceded him to any potential future employers. The skills that had made him dangerous, his ability to identify valuable work and appropriate it for his own advancement, had been permanently neutralized by the exposure of his methods. As evening approached and the Chicago skyline began to light up outside my office windows, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction at how completely the tables had turned. Julian had entered that investor presentation confident that he was about to claim credit for breakthrough technology that would establish his reputation as an innovative leader. Instead, he'd walked into a carefully constructed trap that had exposed his deception to the people whose opinions mattered most in our industry. His attempt to steal my work had become the catalyst for my independence and success, while simultaneously destroying his own career prospects. The presentation that was supposed to be his triumph had become my launching pad into entrepreneurship. The technology he'd tried to appropriate had become the foundation of a company that was revolutionizing how businesses approach data analysis and decision-making. But more than anything else, Julian's theft had taught me that the most effective response to injustice wasn't anger or revenge, but patience, preparation, and the strategic application of truth. By documenting everything, gathering evidence systematically, and choosing the perfect moment to reveal that evidence, I'd achieved a result that was both more satisfying and more permanent than any emotional response could have provided. The forensic audit trail that had destroyed Julian's credibility was still embedded in Insight Grid's codebase, serving as a permanent reminder of the technology's true origins. Every time Pierce Analytics deployed a new version or licensed the technology to another client, that digital signature testified to the importance of integrity and innovation. I'd learned that in the world of technology, truth had a way of surfacing eventually. Code didn't lie about its authorship. Timestamps didn't fabricate development histories. And sophisticated investors didn't accept superficial explanations when detailed evidence suggested otherwise. Julian had believed that changing presentation slides and rebranding materials would be sufficient to transform theft into legitimate innovation. But he had underestimated both the sophistication of his audience and the indelible nature of digital evidence. The venture capitalists who'd evaluated his presentation weren't easily fooled by marketing rhetoric or polished demonstrations. They'd built successful careers by identifying genuine innovation and distinguishing it from clever imitation. When presented with objective evidence of deception, they'd responded with the kind of professional judgment that had made them successful in the first place. As I prepared to leave the office that evening, I took one last look at the Insight Grid development roadmap displayed on my wall. The technology that Julian had tried to steal was continuing to evolve, improving with each iteration and finding new applications in industries we'd never originally considered. But more importantly, it was evolving under the guidance of its actual creator, someone who understood not just what it could do, but why it worked and how it could be improved. Julian's superficial appropriation could never have achieved that kind of sustained innovation because it wasn't based on genuine understanding or authentic expertise. The attempted theft that had seemed like such a devastating betrayal 9 months ago had ultimately become the best thing that could have happened to my career. Julian's greed and arrogance had forced me to document my work so thoroughly that when the truth emerged, there was no doubt about who deserved credit for Insight Grid's innovation. His deception had also introduced me to investors who recognized not just the value of my technology, but the integrity and competence I demonstrated in exposing his theft. Those relationships had become the foundation of Pierce Analytics' success and my transition from employee to entrepreneur. Most satisfying of all, Julian's attempt to steal my work had backfired so completely that he'd actually advanced my career while destroying his own. The presentation that was supposed to establish his reputation as an innovative leader had instead revealed him as a thief and a fraud, while simultaneously launching my company and validating my technology. As I walked through the empty office toward the elevator, I reflected on how completely the situation had been transformed. Julian was somewhere in Milwaukee, working at a consulting firm that probably didn't know about his history of claiming credit for other people's work. Meanwhile, I was building a company that was revolutionizing how businesses approach data analysis and strategic decision-making. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside, watching the floor numbers descend as I headed home to my apartment overlooking Lake Michigan. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, new problems to solve, and new technologies to develop. But tonight, I was content to remember that sometimes the best revenge wasn't revenge at all. Sometimes it was simply allowing thieves to destroy themselves with their own greed and incompetence, while using their attempted theft as motivation to build something far more valuable than they'd ever imagined possible. Julian Stark had tried to steal my work. Instead, he'd given me my freedom.